Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Vicente Cruz. I am the Oakland Greens Event and Fundraising Coordinator. Thank you and welcome to our second annual fundraising event. This year we have Tracy Rosenberg. We'll be talking about Kpfa, the direction of our local station here, especially local station board elections. We should be having certification here in a day or so. I think it is finalized, but we look forward. We'll have a short presentation by Tracy, and then, as always, how we like to do these are really about more of a discussion, and your opinions are just as valued as any of others. No one is better, or some of us may have more experience, but we want to hear your voices and your questions. And the goal of all of our events, and this one in particular, is how can we have community radio be a voice for everyone? Right? It doesn't seem like the system is working for everyone, right? How it's designed to work, it's not designed for everyone. And we can see that, and it's getting worse and worse and worse. How can we use the voice of community radio that we all, the listeners and members that donate, create a voice for real change so that we can get people before profit candidates elected, and the electoral people will have an educated view. So I'm going to shut up, and without further ado, please join me and welcome Tracy Rosenberg. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's a great privilege to be able to speak to you today. I always start with a bit of a joke when I'm talking about Kpfa and Pacifica, but the first time I was ever inside the building on 1929 Berkeley Way was when I climbed a ladder over private security and a bunch of police who were then occupying the station to the second floor news department, jumped off the ladder into the balcony, was met by a cop who forced me to the ground. And at that moment, I should have known what my involvement with Kpfa was going to feel like. So it's been 22 years since that date. I can certainly give you my Kpfa resume, and I guess I should. I actually worked at the station as the program.
You got muted, Tracy. Sorry, you got muted.
How did that happen? Oh my God. So where was I when I got muted? So
right at the beginning of your resume.
Okay. So anyway, I was just going to give you sort of my brief Kpfa resume in short, just so you understand where I'm coming from in terms of talking about this. I worked as the program coordinator at the station on staff between 2000 and 2001, facilitated the then program council as a community representative from basically 2001 to 2004, with some off and on periods there. Was the election supervisor in 2006, served on the local station board from 2007 to 2013 as a listener representative, and was a national representative to the Pacifica National Board from 2010 to 2013, and the foundation treasurer for 3 of those years, 2011, 2012, and 2013. Since 2014, I have written, edited, and published a sort of a Kpfa or Pacifica newsletter or blog called Pacifica in Exile that some of you may have seen. And believe it or not, I've been doing that for 7 years now. Okay. However, I genuinely think that I'm more qualified to have this conversation, not because of my Kpfa resume, but because of my day job, which is as the executive director of Media Alliance, which is a democratic communications advocate in the Bay Area, been around since 1976. And basically, we focus on the need for a people's media. And what I sort of, want to say here is, regardless of platform, because Pacifica is just one of many platforms that has tried to fill that function, that need, it doesn't change. So I want to talk a little bit about Pacifica's history, because I'm a big believer that everything that is happening now has sort of already happened before in some other form. And I think it helps to kind of ground the conversation. So when you start talking about Pacifica, you have to talk about the founder, Lou Hill. He was a number of things. He was an employee in commercial radio, which in the 1940s, just like now, was a bunch of tripe. He was a pacifist and he was a Quaker. It's important to say that in the 1940s, to be a pacifist was a rather unusual position. We all remember the Vietnam War and the anti-imperialist movements that sprung up. But when you're talking about World War II, there was a pretty broad consensus for war. So to be one of the few holdouts was to be one of a very, very small group. So he started to think, what would it mean if skilled broadcasters could say anything that they wanted on air? For example, he could talk about his pacifism. Would people pay for such a service? You know, because he was savvy about the impact of who's paying for the platform, and that, you know, people talk about editorial walls and all that crap. But in the end, who pays impacts the content. So what would happen if the broadcasters didn't work for advertisers, didn't work for corporations, didn't work for philanthropists, but actually worked directly for the people? Would radio change? Would media change? Would the world change? So he acted on it. The Pacifica Foundation was founded in 1946. KPFA went on air in 1949 as the first of what would eventually become 5 stations across the country. And the original answer is it didn't really work. KPFA had to be bailed out by, of all things, the Ford Foundation in the early 50s, or it would have gone belly up. And Henry Ford, the old Nazi, would be rolling in his grave, but basically the Ford Foundation saved KPFA and Pacifica. And then a couple of things happened. The first was the counterculture, beginning with the Beats in the mid to late 50s, the hippies, the yippies, etc. And along with that counterculture came a number of things, a huge population bulge that was fixated on that counterculture. And what was essentially the most prosperous economy in the post-war decades in the US that the world had ever seen. So people had disposable income, and a huge population of folks was enormously interested in the counterculture, wanted to hear about it and wanted to talk about it. So Pacifica was basically able to ride the crest of the counterculture. And this started to fall apart when the counterculture started to fall apart in the late 70s and the early 80s. And there were 2 basic trends that started to kind of open up. And they're important to kind of talk about because basically they are still in play. One of the frustrating things about Pacifica is the things that were ripping it apart in the 1980s are largely ripping it apart today, 40 years later. So the first was sort of a push to implement what the counterculture really said and meant, to kind of lose the elitism and become sort of the voice of the unheard. Not the voice of an academic, educated, liberal, bohemian, affluent group, but really the voice of the marginalized, the pushed down, the vulnerable, who, you know, aren't heard in any sort of commercial media for, you know, very specific economic reasons, because they don't have the money to donate and to support the platform. And that, of course, opened up the big question of, would this sort of academic, educated, boho, liberal, affluent audience pay to listen to the voices of the unheard, or did they mostly just want to listen to each other? And I think that we see that tension very much in the KPFA of today. The second trend was basically the creation of public radio. It's important to say that Lou Hill thought of the whole thing first, but like any good idea, then along came the Carnegie Commission, and basically public radio became a thing. And while it institutionalized a lot of Hill's ideas about radio in the public interest, it kind of articulated it in a couple of different ways. that it would essentially appeal in sort of a targeted, thought out way to middle class, educated, affluent, largely urban folks, and that it would be funded by underwriting, which is a way of saying advertising, but not really. So the public radio movement came along. It came along with a goal to have a product that would appeal to underwriters, that would appeal to affluent middle-class communities with disposable income. And then Pacifica wanted the grant money that the feds had set up through the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. So they sort of became subject to what we would call the cleanup instincts of the CPB and the DC establishment, which didn't really want to hear about World War II pacifism or essentially the radical fringe of anything. So all of these tensions had been building, and it all blew up in 1999, largely, and it's important to say this, as an ideological struggle, not a financial one. It was basically helped along by a national board that sort of embraced the petty dictator stuff, and a email that went to the wrong place that talked about reprogramming stations and selling them. And so the second trend that I'm talking about, basically the healthy station faction, essentially lost that battle, but they never gave up and they're still there. So Pacifica adopted, after this struggle, an enormously open, enormously horizontal structure. And basically, it was not an ideology. It was not something that sort of decided what the organization was going to be. It was essentially something that said, let's have a really horizontal, open structure with maximum participation. And we believe that if that happens, that grassroots ideologies would have the majority. And that, rather than basically taking those who had, lost that battle and crushing them and purging them from the organization, we would take a more progressive attitude and try to have a diversity of viewpoints and let the best ideas win. And that basically is the system that we've had for the past 22 years. So what has it led to? In the decade between 2000 and 2010, a number of things happened. One is that you had a sort of a struggle and a push me, pull you with the idea of sort of, what kind of network are we? Are we basically a public radio network, an alternative to NPR? Or are we something completely different? Are we a grassroots radio experiment? And that push me, pull you, and that back and forth, because again, it's important to say the structure never answered that question. The structure just set up the fight. Really prevented Pacifica from doing two things. It prevented it from what I would call rebranding itself, but which a lot of us would basically call just figuring out what your mission statement really means and what you do and where you stand as an organization. And secondly, responding to all the technological changes that the internet had brought in. For most of Pacifica's history, it was really the only mass media where you could hear the counterculture. But that, of course, changed. And on the internet, everything is on demand. You can listen to anything that you want, whenever you want, wherever you want. So the reality of Pacifica being a hub was something that was not as clear. And of course, Pacifica could have, jumped in and, consolidated a lot of voices from other places and reestablished itself as a counterculture hub, but it didn't really do that. So you had a situation where Pacifica, rather than being the place, became one of many places. And then in 2010, largely because of those trends that I'm discussing, the financial stress started. And the last decade between 2010 and 2020 has been a scarcity battle with limited resources. And of course, the whole question of sort of where those resources go, right? So when you take a look at sort of the governance structure, and I'm going to talk about it briefly because you've all had to weigh in on the governance structure as of late. You'll probably have to again, and you have these LSB elections where basically people come to you and ask you to sort of make governance decisions about this network, or to try to. So the good parts of the system that came in 2003 was the first year. So we're about 20 years into this experiment. Openness, really anybody, literally anybody who wants to can participate. So there are really no barriers to entry besides wanting to do a little bit of sweat equity. It is always possible to completely reset the governance structure in 1 3-year period. Nothing is set in stone. And you have a scenario where sort of diversity of viewpoints is built in. I think people at this point know what proportional representation is, so I won't talk about it, but as a structure, its goal is to have as many viewpoints as possible represented. And that is absolutely something that Pacifica embraced, although sometimes people would say trying to run a nonprofit organization with as many diverse viewpoints as possible is a big challenge, right? Because normally in a not-for-profit organization, people try to sort of fill the board and the executive roles with people who pretty much agree on things. Pacifica sort of takes the opposite approach. So the bad part of this structure, as I said, proportional representation is kind of based on certain things. Like this whole structure is based on certain things, which is that in the end, after all the viewpoints are surfaced, people will work together for the good of the whole. They will compromise. That's the whole basis of sort of diversity of viewpoints. It's not that people will engage in a tug of war and take the whole thing down. However, that belief about the Pacifica community has not turned out to be true. There is a great deal of let's engage in the tug of war until we pull the whole thing down. And we've seen that. Financial scarcity leads to a lot of doomsday thinking and a lot of people thinking it's going to collapse anyway, so let's just get our part of it. When you have financial scarcity, people operate from fear, not their best thinking, usually, and they operate from turf and they try to protect themselves. And I think all of those dynamics get worse as financial scarcity increases. Finally, whenever you have a situation where the whole governance structure is up for grabs every couple of years, there's not a lot of stability and there's a bit of a pendulum, like this side has a bit of an advantage for a couple of years, then that side has an advantage for a couple of years. And so it can be difficult to make steady progress on goals because you get a little bit of 3 steps forward, 3 steps back. And a sense of, well, we don't really have to do this because the folks that are pushing it might not get reelected and then the whole thing will fall apart anyway. So let's not do this if we disagree with it, right? So those are kind of what the bad parts are. So where are we now? I'm going to talk about national first and then a little bit about KPFA specifically, and then we'll be done. I mean, certainly on the national level, we have seen that pendulum effect largely sort of making progress towards goals very much sort of stop and start. It's in fits, right? A group of people will do something, then they'll leave or they won't be reelected, and then it kind of goes back to zero and has to be started up once again. There's a scarcity dynamic and a lot of fear. So you have desires for control, and that has gone so far as people saying we should break the whole thing up into something more manageable that we can control. And a lot of these efforts come out of KPFA. And so we have had since 2015, which is only 5.5 years ago, 3 different efforts from folks at KPFA to basically break up the network and set up some other structure that would be much more controllable. The 5 stations tend to feel competitive with each other, not supportive. I mean, it's actually really wonderful to be in a network of 5 stations. You would think that this would provide the opportunity to help each other out, to support each other, to share resources. But instead, it's become kind of competitive, with people saying, well, this station isn't doing well. They're hurting our station. We should cut them loose, or reprogram them, or sell them, or get rid of them. This station might be doing better than us. We hate them. And so these kinds of, local rivalries inside of one not-for-profit don't make any sense. I mean, lots of you have run nonprofit organizations, and maybe you have two different offices, but you don't have a situation where the Southern California office and the Northern California office try to kill each other, right? Because that doesn't work. But you have a lot of that going on in Pacifica. And, the local fights at each of the 5 stations, and I always say that each station is its own soap opera. KPFA is certainly plenty of soap opera to go around, and we'll talk about that a bit. But, each station has its own saga and its own story and its own history. And so what happens with the PNB, which basically scoops up 4 people from each of these 5 local boards and shoves them all in one room, that the PNB, rather than becoming an Isle of Sanity for the whole national organization, becomes all 5 of these local fights going on simultaneously in the same room. And it can be enormously confusing. And I think anyone will tell you, when they graduate from a local station board to a national board, they walk in and it's totally like, what the hell is going on here, right? Because basically they get embroiled in 4 different local fights they didn't know anything about. So I think that it's very, fair to say that the local dysfunction basically channels upward to the national. And that's the problem, because the national has, certain specific responsibilities, in terms of administration and reporting and, stuff that it kind of has to do to keep this functional. And instead, it's often getting sort of, pulled down into being the referee on local fights. So KPFA specifically, I'm sure that Greens have lots of interest in this. It's important to say that KPFA is one of the few outlets that does cover some community issues. There's a amount in the Bay Area, and we are seeing that as a lot of local news outlets basically fall apart. It's important that KPFA is here, and we want. That said, KPFA often says one thing and does the other. The marketing is all about people's radio with the drummer and yet
Sorry to interrupt, Tracy. Sorry to interrupt your audio and video. Your video's frozen, your audio's cutting out on your bandwidth. I think if you turn off your camera, we should be able to hear you.
Oh no. Seems fine over here.
This not only of live events, but yes, now that we're in this technology. The other thing you could do is log out and then just use the same link and log back in again as well. And that's what they're doing, which actually gives me the opportunity, because also I don't believe in overproducing things, so I always forget stuff. So for the other new people that have come in, if you do not want to have your voice or face on, because this is a recorded event, you don't have to. If you still want to submit questions, you can email oaklandgreenparty@gmail.com. I am monitoring that email and can ask the questions for you. Also, what I want to make also in a disclaimer is this new event now in the afternoon is something that we're also going to be doing in 2022. We're taking a relaxed approach like a couple of other groups. So we make no judgments on what you do on camera or not. I am a disabled vet and I use cannabis rather than opioids. But what I will say is if you wouldn't want your mama to see it, you probably shouldn't do it on camera. That's how we make no other judgments other than that. And then also during the Q&A, remember, I don't and I'm the one who produces these events, don't like some of the, what I hear, let me rephrase. I don't like the way I hear it when they talk about identify yourself. So you don't have to give your government name, but when it gets to the Q&A, please just go ahead and just identify yourself however you want to be called. And and Tracy was back up, and here she comes again. How you doing? Can we get a sound check? She's still joining. I only see video. I don't see any audio for you, Tracy, if you can hear.
I sent you.
Oh, yeah, but still breaking up. And it's funny, and on the actual Zoom, it shows you don't have audio.
Vicente, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, well, let me go ahead and finish the presentation.
Yes, thank you.
I'll put it back on.
Okay.
All right. So we're at Kpfa specifically. So that's, as I said, Kpfa often says one thing and does another.
Yeah, the internet is kicking her off again. I wonder if they. Oh, and you're back. I guess I could also ask: is this a laptop or a actual tower computer? Yeah, we can't hear you, and you're logging on and off. Oh yeah, as Greg said, if you could telephone in instead of a computer. Yeah, it doesn't. Unless I do gallery view.
Can you hear me now?
Let's see.
Can you hear me?
Keep on going. No, yeah, booted again. Yeah, when she comes back, let's see if I ask her to see if Tracy will call in instead.
The last time I actually could hear her.
Yeah. So Tracy, it's still logging you on and off. And like I said, over in my, as the host, in my view, it doesn't even say you have audio, only video at all. Either another device or if you actually have, if you're using Wi-Fi, if you plug your device directly into your router, that would probably could fix it as well. Or as Greg suggested, just calling in on the phone. And if you don't have that, I could quickly email you, and I'll have my assistant manager, Justin, tell jokes while I'm doing that. And right now, Justin is just panicking. But we don't hear you, Tracy. But those would be my suggestions, definitely. I don't like Wi-Fi anyway, except it's on my phone. Yeah, it's logging her on and off. I got all the other to no government names. If you want to drink and smoke on camera. Who's that? Greg? Thank you. Oh, it's Justin. Thank you very much. Look at that. Justin. You sure you've never done stage managing before?
Done it a lot before.
Oh, there you go. See, that's how it is. And let's see, and I see you back, Tracy, with video and audio. I mean, you are muted, but if you unmute yourself.
We lost her.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you now.
All right. Well, let me finish the presentation.
Yes.
I still have this problem. I don't know what's going on, but we will make the best of it. A couple of times I was here, but it seemed like I was muted. But anyway, hopefully we can get through the end. So Kpfa specifically, as I said, they often say one thing and do another. The marketing that you will get complete with the new drummer logo is all about the people's media, but in reality, the stations relies on organized groups of fairly affluent, politically connected locals who often threaten reputational damage to dissidents and generally want a fairly controlled experience. Many would say that there's also an age discrepancy, that a lot of these are aging boomers clinging to power. But what I would say is that basically what you have is what is often called gatekeeping, a scenario where if you are connected to folks connected with the power balance, you will largely see the issues that are important to you covered. But if you lack those kinds of connections, the station often feels like a pretty closed door. And so that makes the station of limited value to social justice groups, because the way in is basically gate kept and protected in terms of turf. And when the collections come about, there's always a lot of tumult and carrying on, because basically the conversation about how KPFA is, the discrepancies between sort of what KPFA says it is and what it actually is, and if there are significant changes that should be made, is largely kept off of the airwaves. You know, these subjects are not debated. They're not debated on air. They're not raised. So listeners sort of, want to do the right thing and probably have a sort of a vague sense that some changes would be good at the station, but they don't really know what it is that they're supposed to do to make that happen. I mean, in theory, they can vote, but it's like vote for who, and there's a lack of a sort of the kind of vital debate that you sort of need for an institution to change. And when an institution says that it's basically accountable to you, but you don't really need to know what's going on, then you sort of have to take that as the mixed message that it is. So we're supposed to be talking about how these elections are going to impact KPFA and the way forward, and we thought that we would have the results, and we don't, which basically means it's a little bit hard to tell. As people know, there were two slates, Rescue Pacifica, which a lot of Oakland Greens participated in, and something that called itself Pacifica Protectors, which is part of what used to be called Save KPFA, which was largely a sort of an institutional protection platform, and largely the idea that the station is perfectly fine the way that it is, and no, we shouldn't talk about changes. We don't know who won. We will find out. And I think I'm going to pretty much stop the presentation there. I'm happy to answer questions about any of the specific stuff that people have seen and experienced, including naming names and all that stuff. But I wanted to sort of see where the group was in terms of how much nitty-gritty you wanted to hear. And I think that's a fairly good history of sort of how we got here, and the ways in which arguments that were not settled 40 years ago are still impacting what we are listening to today. So let me go back on, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Will, and we already have hands raised. And so how this is going to work for Q&A, we are small enough that, I'll put a 3-minute cap, and you don't have to ask a question. You can just make a comment as well. We don't make those judgments here, I hope. Again, because I want it to be a discussion. You can raise your hand with the raise hand feature. You can put it in the chat. There's not a lot of us with camera, but you can raise your hand on camera. We do have enough people who can moderate all this stuff and have the stack, and it wants to go for you first. And so already with the hand up, I see, Michael, please go ahead and ask a question or comment.
Well, I want to make a comment, and I just want to elaborate a little bit on the history.
And then I'll put my hand up next.
Sure.
Anyway, I want to start with the question of the decline in the movement, and the movement and the move to the right of the social movement, which I think has really been reflected in KPFA strongly. That is the question of the Democratic Party has become a central point in the fights on KPFA.
Mm-hmm.
That is basically the KPFA is reflecting a rebirth of lesser evilism partly because of the Trumpism, but also just the general movement to the right of large sections of what used to be the radical movement in this country. And I think that that's something that until that changes, I don't have any much hope for this process. I mean, basically, the people who are opposed to it have managed to stave off some of the worst of it, but they're not making any progress in making it better either. And so for years, I've stopped. I don't give a penny to Kpfa, and I will not until I understand, I can see that my party is actually reflected in the doings at Kpfa. And one last thing, and that is the news. What I see in the news is NPR. Is the movement towards an NPR news. I can get it on NPR. What I'm not getting is the more radical viewpoints and news items that should be available on a station like Kpfa. Over.
No disagreement there. What I tried to kind of point out is that this sort of push and tension, which is very much about Democratic Party versus grassroots organizing, has been around since the 80s, and Pacifica has never decided where it stands. And, 40 years of arguing has not gotten us to a good place. But you're absolutely right. And when I talk about a Democratic, liberal, boho, affluent audience, I'm largely talking about a Democratic Party aligned audience. And if that's where the majority of the money is coming from, just like Lou Hill said, that's where the programming is largely going to be pointed towards. And that is absolutely the case. And I think the station understands that extremely well. The news department has been headed by the same folks for 40 plus years. I guess we're getting on 50 now. And it is essentially a wire service translation project with a liberal edge. In other words, what it mostly does is take the stories that come out on the wire that go to every newspaper and television outlet and fix them up a bit and broadcast them, can read them out loud. It is not in any sense a deconstruction of the prevailing news and prevailing news narratives. There are a couple of, small windows and folks that try, but but in essence, it's not. And the reality is that there are many sources now for much better news than you can get on Kpfa. And I think the station is suffering as a result. And it's also seeing a change in its audience, because when you pursue a certain sort of programming philosophy, it's obvious that people that like it will stick around and give you money, and people that don't like it will take a walk. And so in a way, there's an inverse ratio between less radical programming and less radical audience, right? They feed each other.
Right. It is myself, and then there's a question in the chat, and I will start, and I have so many questions. I will start by saying I feel that the Green Party is represented on the Kpfa LSB. We're not represented when it comes to even nonpartisan elections on the station. And this is not for lack of trying. I mean, we've given up now, because after 8 years, but I've been in Oakland now so long, I forget back then, but just literally begging in some cases to that, oh, well, you're having that candidate, why not this one on? So that's my own feelings. But so my question to you, actually, I'm just going to go down my list here. So Tracy, you think, so right now it is $25 to become a voting member
Per year, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Would you support or think it would be a good idea if you were to lower that to $5?
Well, actually, the proposals that I've heard are to raise it, not to lower it within the Pacifica community, because of those financial scarcity reasons that I talked about. For a long time, and this does exist in the bylaws, there was a potential waiver of the fee for folks that were financially pressed. For a number of years, some of the stations, specifically the ones in Houston and the ones in New York, had a large prison audience. And of course, folks in prison can't pay $25 a year or $5 a year or anything. So there used to be a waiver program for those members of the audience, but it became a kind of a political football, so it isn't really used nowadays. I think, what do I think? I'm sensitive to the financial scarcity. After all, I was the treasurer for 3 years and I had to balance those numbers and they didn't always balance. But I do think that you certainly don't want to make it more exclusive than it already is. And to be clear, you know, with COVID-19, there's a lot of financial stress out there. We've got a stalled economy and people don't always have the discretionary income that they had in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, right? Rent and housing now is 50, 60, 70% of people's income. And the rest of the media has essentially followed in Pacifica's footsteps. Now it's all trying to be listener sponsored, right? So your local newspaper wants your money, and your hyper local news site wants your money. ProPublica wants your money. Huffington Post wants your money. The Intercept wants your money. It's endless. And nobody can afford to keep all of these outlets alive. So they're picking and choosing. And Pacifica doesn't always find itself the winner in that kind of contest. So I think you might benefit in terms of, you know, making that waiver program more vital. But I think it's important to understand that in a financially stressed organization, they are looking for money. So the audience that can give them money has a lot of clout here. And sometimes ideology versus money, you know, ideology doesn't always win. So a part of sort of, you know, the Pacifica puzzle is locating folks with radical politics and an income who are willing to try to, you know, push the station in the direction that it needs to go. And there definitely are some possibilities out there, but I think a lot of the world of radical politics has kind of given up on Pacifica. And I'm not sure they should, because the reality is you don't have any other mass media that you can potentially utilize. But Pacifica is there. And if you think about the number of people that these radio stations can reach, not that they do reach, but that they can reach across the country, it's massive. So there's definitely an opportunity here. And the question is whether it can be capitalized on.
Okay, so we have a question from the chat, and then Justin, assistant stage manager Justin will be on stack next. So the question from the chat is, if the local station board election results in a 50-50 split on the LSB, what do you think will happen if it ends up being 50-50?
Interesting. Well, the LSB has probably been, for the preponderance of the past decade, dominated by the protectors, Save Kpfa folks. And that has basically led to the station sort of icing in some of these neoliberal tendencies that we've been talking about, right? If that changes to a 50-50 split, or even a potential majority that change, then potentially a whole bunch of things open up. The LSB itself is not, you know, the entity that sort of programs the station, and it shouldn't be, but it can certainly put a lot of frameworks in place that can kind of change how these decisions are being made. The last time that there was a non-Save Kpfa majority on the LSB, I was part of it. Back in 2010, we saw some significant changes, including what was on in the morning. And I paid for that. But that said, it was for a couple of years a very different kind of station. And I also want to say that that didn't cause a financial collapse, despite what people thought. The financial collapse happened before it, but it did cause a significant loss of turf inside the station. And that was something that was deemed not to be acceptable. And I think it also alienated a chunk of the audience, because the reality is when you make programming changes that are significant, that change the taste and flavor of the station, the audience that was committed to that programming kind of gets upset, right? And that has happened all of the way through the process. But at a certain point, you have to make a decision, and you have to sort of pick an audience to serve, and it can't be everyone, because everyone doesn't want the same things. And the station has had trouble making that kind of choice. And that's really what a board is supposed to do. A board is supposed to sort of say, this is the organization that we are. These are the people that we try to serve. These are our goals. This is how we're going to execute on those goals. And we understand that that means that we will serve some populations and other populations, maybe not so much. And we will do certain things, but not other things. And that kind of focused decision-making really hasn't existed at KPFA, or if it has, it's been entirely neoliberal in nature. So we could look at a change of that consensus. But that said, that would probably result in the short term, at least, more turbulence and more, quotation marks, fighting. So people might not see it as progress. They might see it as ongoing turbulence. But you can never get to something without going through things. And I think in this case, change is deeply called for and deeply needed.
Thanks. Next up, Justin, you're on Stack.
Hi there. Thanks. I'm really enjoying this presentation. I really like thinking about the history of the station. And my question is kind of a little bit more bigger picture. I'm a member of KPFA and I participate in the elections, and so I'm kind of up on the issues surrounding the politics, at least on that level. But a lot of the minutia that goes on, inside, I wouldn't be aware of. But
Yeah.
and so let's see. My question is, lately it seems like in every electoral opportunity, the New Day Pacifica group is putting forth a change to the bylaws or something or other, and it feels like it's always more or less the same concept coming at me, that it's essentially a reduction of, or a centralizing of decision-making power. And unfortunately, I don't remember if there are other proposals to change things sort of, in some other way that's not doing that, but it's still beneficial. And I like how you were thinking about how the station has come to be, and the organizing structure is changing over the years. So what are some ideas for changing things that haven't been proposed recently that wouldn't consolidate power and would keep a number of voices?
Right.
Some examples might be, within a station, you could have a collective staff structure, where there's not necessarily one person in charge. It's not so much a hierarchy. So yeah, staff collective model. I know that's been done at some other stations, WRT, Community Radio in Madison. I used to serve on the board, and they have that model, and it worked really well during that time, and I assume it still is. Or something more like on a national scale where, what if the 5 Pacifica stations were disaffiliated? Maybe not entirely, but in some limited way. What would happen to that? I feel like the recent attacks coming on the democratic structure would have to change their approach, or it would even be maybe so interested if they knew that they couldn't have, all 5. It would have to be station by station. So I'm just, it's amusing, really. I don't know how possible it really is to change certain of these things, or if it's even a good idea. But anyway, that's my rambling comment and questions, and I appreciate any thoughts about it.
Sure. It's a good question. I mean, obviously people have had to think about bylaws and structure in a way that you often don't with a nonprofit organization that you're a member of. I mean, generally, You may become member of something and they send you newsletters about what they're doing. And maybe they ask you to vote for a slate, but it's usually a board approved slate and that's it. And you don't really have to think about how would I restructure this organization. And you have had to think about that with Pacifica, and you've had to do it twice in the past 2 years. Neither of those referendums passed. They were both what I would call wolves in sheep's clothing that correctly identified some problems, offered some solutions to those problems, and then sort of added on a command and control framework that was fundamentally anti-democratic and that was kind of in the background, right? It was basically, yeah, there are all these problems. Yes, we should fix them. And by the way, you should put this handful of people in charge. Which is essentially not the answer. We've been through self-appointed boards in Pacifica. And the reality is when you put a handful of people in charge of something that, believe it or not, despite all the financial scarcity, is worth over $100 million in assets, then stuff happens because that's a lot of money to be able to control and a lot of assets. And that's not what you want with a people's organization. That said, I already talked about sort of some negatives of these bylaws, and they are real. We always like to think that, you know, a horizontal organization would fertilize the best ideas and they would rise to the top and then everybody would join together in consensus. And Pacifica, at least, that hasn't happened. And many of you I know participated in things like Occupy that also tried a horizontal structure. And you certainly would have experienced, A, it doesn't always work, and B, there are certain controls that have to be put into place to keep it from devolving into chaos, and largely to keep it from being infiltrated by folks who do not have its best interests at heart. And we should always understand that even as neoliberal as Pacifica is, it is of interest to the FBI, it is of interest to the CIA, and all that infiltration, COINTELPRO stuff exists. So you have people whose intentions are not good. When you actually look at the bylaw structure and what you could do, I think there are some pretty basic things that you could do. For example, longer terms on the national board would help with stability. I am open to the idea that you might want to take the sizes down. 24 is big for a local board, 22 is big for a national board. They could probably be 2/3 of the current size and work just fine. You certainly probably want the elections to be a more orderly process than they currently are. I mean, if the point of the collections is to determine the direction of the organization and the local stations, then you have to surface all of the issues and have conversations about them where people don't understand who and what they're voting for. And that has been a problem since the beginning, because, you know, you get that booklet, now it's online, but you used to get that booklet and it would have 25 people and they'd all write 500 words about how great they are and how they want KPFA to thrive. And you'd have to pick 9 of them and rank them. And it was like, huh, what? You didn't really understand the stakes for what you were voting for. Maybe you knew a couple of them, that's how you made your choices, right? So that system needs to be improved significantly. So I think there are changes that you can make. You just need to sort of free yourself from the command and control kind of goal that is essentially saying, let's fix the structure and let's make sure that these people are in charge. With the first bylaws referendum, it was these people are in charge for a good long time. With the second one, it was for the first 3 years. But in kind of all of those cases, that's basically trying to stack the outcome in advance, and that's not how democracy works. It's just not. So there are ideas out there, as you can probably guess. The bylaws referendum process is long and thorny, takes a lot of energy. And probably there has been a limited amount of energy because the people that are unhappy have a lot more energy than the people that are not so unhappy with the current system. It's always that way. But I think that there are plans to put forward some bylaws changes that are genuinely streamlining efforts and not sort of other things in disguise. And hopefully that would happen not in some super special, incredibly expensive referendum, because we are flushing listener donor money down the toilet every time we do this, but in the context of a regular, normal election process. Because I mean, spending 6 figures to send people a special bylaws referendum is not the kind of thing there's enough money in the world for anywhere. And now it's happened twice in 2 years, and it's not helping the finances. So that's sort of an answer to your question, Justin, which was very long. I hope that touched on a couple of things that you were asking.
I thought so. And not only is it, we shouldn't spend that much money. I want to stick with financial stability and also election participation. So I want to ask your ideas on going back to $5 membership, the waiver. I really love the waiver program, but again, trying to stick with it. If I need $25, right, I can get $25 from one person, or I can get 5, people to give me $5. And it doesn't seem that they push smaller donations enough, or even small donations over. I mean, they're kind of doing the Patreon, like, oh, they want you to be a sustaining member and give, $20 a month. Again, I don't think they stagger that again. So we're going back to still having, as if that would expand membership by doing that. And then also tying it to the elections itself. Right now it's at 10% participation, which I think is atrocious. And would you support, in your idea, would you think that'd be a good idea to raise that? And then how you would market that is, again, more on-air debates, having people interviewed live, right, giving all the candidates live. And I also want to piggyback and agree with you, way too many members in a board. As a small organization of Oakland Greens, it is true that like a lot of the energy, the actual hands-on energy is done by one person, but everything is still done, the ideas and where we're going to go and focus. And actually, we've had some really good debates lately as a collective, and it's a lot easier to do with only 6 to 9 people as it is to do larger. So again, raising the participation rate and how to do that. And then going back again to, well, I want to get $100. I just want, a whole bunch of people to give me $5 each.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this comes up in campaign fundraising all the time, right? Do you really want a bunch of small dollar donations, or do you just want to get a couple of people with a whole bunch of money to bankroll the whole thing? It's a lot easier to get 3 rich people to bankroll it than it is to get hundreds or thousands of people to give you small donations. But I think we have seen in the political arena that it does actually build community power in a way that a couple rich people bankrolling candidate is never going to do. Because when people give you $25, they have skin in the game, right? And if it's just a small amount of people giving you $10,000, then in the end, no one else has skin in the game. And that is important. Let's see. I think it's important for people to get, the Pacifica stations are not all the same. Stations in California, KPFA and to some degree KPFK, are big stations with multi-million-dollar budgets, and they have a lot of staff. I mean, they have between 25 and 50 people working there, all of whom have to get paid, all of whom get health insurance, et cetera. So they need to maintain their multi-million-dollar budgets. If you look at the East Coast stations and the one in Texas, much smaller, budgets are less than $500,000. And they run basically with, core staffs anywhere from 5 to 15 people, and that's it. And everybody else is a volunteer. So they don't have to raise the same amounts of money. So when you look at a station that has to raise $3.5 million a year, which is KPFA's sort of baseline budget, and that is creeping up towards $4 million because the payroll now is hitting $2 million a year. That's a lot of $25 donations, really a lot. So the station, by definition, encourage people $25. it encouraged to handle these money, you know, and get these prices for this time, these gifts. And basically their audience is people that can afford to drop $250 on a photograph. Right? So the programming skews that way, the fundraising skews that way, and it all has to do with the size of amount that you have to meet. And I've said for a long time that I'm not opposed to growth, but holding a payroll is that large forces the station in certain directions.
Oh, I thought it was going to pull itself back together. I was holding out then for internet. Oh, and it was going so well too. Well, we'll wait until we get them back again. It happens, especially if we're wireless. Oh, and Tracy's coming back. Oh, we're having the same problem. You could probably hear me, Tracy. You're having a low internet bandwidth issue again. Low bandwidth moment again.
Yes, back in, you should be able to hear me now. And I had pretty much finished the comment, which was basically that the size of the financial nut that's established to keep the station going, the operating costs are so high that they force various other things to happen that are very antithetical to what you're talking about, which is building community support through low dollar donations.
Yeah.
It's hard to meet a $2 million payroll with $25 a year.
Right. Yeah. Again, yeah, try to increase, well, even though I'm for that. I hear you, but there has to be a different way. Not seeing any, oh wait, I did see, well, I just the comment, Bernie Sanders got lots of small donations. I don't think we need that kind of money anyway, right? I think I call it, and actually the Oakland Greens call it, navigating a corrupt capitalist system, right? But as the Mayan said, right, you got to follow the river. The river knows where it's going. If you try to fight it, all you're going to do is capsize, right? So you got to kind of navigate it the best you can, and then hopefully get enough people for-profit candidates elected, whether it be on the local station board or any sort of mayors, governors, senators, and eventually in higher national offices that will make the tax dollars work for the people, right? And we can get a entirely new system, rewrite it again, treat America as its apartheid, which, you can definitely make a case that it kind of is. And it looks like we definitely do have you back both ways, video and audio. You can turn your audio on. But seeing no other hands, I do have another question. I'm just going down my list. Switching to kind of programming, which I think still would tie to participation and financial stability. I personally, one of the things I loved about KPFA, and until I decided to run, full transparency, I am a candidate, not on any slate, but I was an independent candidate. I have questions about that on the back. And then I guess I should also, full transparency, that my next step actually is I want to see if I can get in, hold on, sorry, Tracy's coming back, see if I can join the election. Renee will stay, see if I can join her team and try to create, again, the election system that we're kind of talking about. Now I have to wait for Tracy, but I have a question.
I'm here. I'm here. I just decided to log in on my laptop as well and see if that's a bit more stable.
Got it.
Maybe you can just let my laptop in, I'll have a backup device and maybe.
All right, got it. Yep, that's smart. I hear you. All right, so then the next question, again, back on programming. And one of the things I loved was that there was a lot of views and news that I didn't agree with. And I would say I just love to debate. My mama would say I love to argue. So I really enjoyed the fact that it had that, but it seems that a lot of, and I mean, like you said, in your introduction about climbing the fence, and then like Dennis Bernstein had drama there too, where they're banging on the doors trying to get him out and all types of stuff too. You think a more diverse programming model and having local station board candidates go out into the community, like should have tables from people where listeners are not just members, listen, what would you like to see? And then bring that back. Do you think that kind of a program model would be beneficial to KPFA and Pacifica in general too.
Sure. I mean, when I was the program coordinator and facilitating the program council, we did something I don't think KPFA has done since, which we had an open sort of program application process. The idea being that if you had an idea for a program and you had the capability to execute on it, which nowadays people have, I mean, it's not that hard to make a podcast. Send us your proposal, send us a demo tape, and we'll listen to it and potentially put you in line when a programming slot opens up, which admittedly doesn't happen as frequently as it could. And we did that for a number of years against a certain amount of, opposition inside the station. But we had sort of an opening, and there are about 5 or 6 programs, many of which you guys are familiar with, that came on air that way. And I can give you a list. And around 2005, that door kind of shut. And KPFA has not done that since. And I thought it was a really wonderful way to bring people into the station. A, you discover local talent that you didn't know was out there. And B, when people feel like it's an open door, it tends to open not only their ears, but also their pocketbooks, because we give money to things that we feel that we are a part of. And, that's the thing that kind of changes people from I'm a passive listener to this is part of my community and part of what matters to me and something that I need to help support and make sure that it stays here. In terms of the shows that came on through that program council process, I'll give you a short list: Voices of the Middle East and North Africa, the Women's Magazine, Education Today, not Apex Express, but Full Circle, the apprenticeship program came on that way. Guns and Butter, which later became somewhat controversial. But it was a bunch of programs that have turned out to be successful, most of which have had long runs. And, one of the things that KPFA has and has always had is an apprenticeship program. And we have, and one of the things that we did as a program council is if people came in and they wanted to provide programming content, but there were things that they needed to learn technically to be able to kind of do that, we would match up apprentices with community groups to help them get going. That's what happened, for example, with Voices of the Middle East and North Africa. They had great ideas. They were not exactly polished radio broadcasters at that period of time. So an apprentice came along and sort of helped them get up and running. And this program is still on at 11 a.m. on, I think, Thursdays or Fridays. And it has run on KPFA for years and years and years. So I guess what I would say is that, yes, outreach is important, but it should be about what the station has the opportunity to offer, which is people's media. So sort of, to make the outreach meaningful, it's not just listen to what we choose to put on the radio, but be a part of it. And that doesn't have to be permanent, hour-long slots. It can also be special programs, occasional programs. I mean, you don't necessarily want to be a radio broadcaster forever, but maybe there's a 2-hour special that you could produce on a subject that's really important that nobody else is covering, and you're part of the community that really knows this issue. And rather than getting an interview from a professional broadcaster, maybe you produce your own program. And maybe that's how the grassroots voice actually gets heard. And that's something that the station could easily do, it just doesn't. And a lot of that is kind of that turf stuff, which is, I've had this slot on Tuesdays at 11 p.m. for 900 years, and I am not taking even 1 week off. And it's like, well, yeah, but you should, right? Because this is what a community radio station is for. And I think that you could do those things. And if you did, you'd be looking at something very different. And I think it would be exciting for listeners, because there'd be different things on the air sometimes. So that's sort of, my answer for what meaningful community outreach by a radio station looks like.
Thank you. And from the chat, do you know what the largest radio stations to the left of NPR are, and or anywhere in the country? And is there anything we could learn from them?
There's not a lot out there that is to the left of NPR. What there is not large. There are some community radio stations in the wake of Pacifica. People like Lorenzo Camilam, who some of you may have heard, he wrote Sex and Broadcasting, sort of picked up with some evangelism and went out to start other community radio stations. They had some success. And this is part of what got the feds so nervous that they started to try to clean up community radio. But a couple of them are still around. Kpfa up in Portland. There's a station in Colorado whose call letters are escaping me right now. There's a station in Maine. There's WORT, W-O-R-T, in Madison. Those stations tend to gravitate to a group called the Grassroots Radio Conference, or the Grassroots Radio Coalition, or GRC. You can look them up on the internet. They have annual conferences and regular calls. And in general, those stations are pretty radical. They are also generally small. Biggest budget is probably $2 million, and several are smaller than that. But they do provide a model for a community radio, radical radio station that's embedded in its community, that runs on an amount of money that it can reasonably raise every year. The difference between these sort of community radio stations and KPFA is they are not part of a national network. And you can make an argument that Pacifica as a national network should be having a national impact and not just be a micro hyper local kind of thing. But that said, that they certainly provide a model for servicing a community in a radical grassroots kind of way. That said, there are not that many of them left.
Thank you. I want to go back to money in elections. So I mentioned before, full transparency, that I was a candidate, but I didn't have any slate. So both, excuse me again, both slates, spend money. It looked like the protectors had way more money than anyone else, but both of them sent out mailers to people. But I don't know about any of the other independent candidates, but I didn't have any money. I had no access to any of the members' email list to actually campaign to them. Do you think that it's a good model, which could be stopping more radicals even from, we've already heard from one member of our cast and audience saying that they've stopped giving money because it's not radical enough. You think we're losing money by having the same model as the corrupt system of, oh, well, if you need to pay to play. So if you have money as candidate, you can get your word out. If you don't, no one knows who you are. Do you think taking money out of it is a good idea?
All true. Years ago, I was an advocate for the fact that I thought that we should ban slates altogether. What I got told is that the Supreme Court basically said, money is free speech. We can't do that. People are allowed to spend whatever they want to spend on their own campaigns. And this is the part where you say, well, the Supreme Court and justice are not always the same thing. And that this is a private nonprofit organization. And I'm not so sure that we are, that we're a public entity in quite that way. That said, the argument was lost long ago. Here at KPFA, it was the Save KPFA folks who sent out the first slate card. I know that because I was the collection supervisor when they did it. And, it blew things wide open. And so now it's kind of like an arms race, and the candidates get together in slates for power. There's generally A slate and B slate, and you have to pick one, more or less. And all of the money that is raised is basically money that doesn't go into the radio station. It's money that, is diverted from the radio station, and it primarily goes for paper and emails and postcards that people are not always, from what I can see, all that thrilled to get. And all of this is happening sort of outside because we're not using the radio station itself to raise up the election and to sort of, let people get to know the candidates. I mean, we have a way to get this information out to the listeners, but because we're not using it, we've set up this kind of satellite system. And the satellite system requires money. It makes running for the board arduous. It diverts funds from the station that it could otherwise expect to receive from people. And it is really like a barrier to entry because Vicente, you were brave enough to run as an independent candidate, but most people don't because they figure that they can't get elected. So they're sort of forced to ally with this slate or the other slate. Most people just don't do it as independent candidates. It creates, I think, a discomfort with running for the LSB that probably shouldn't be out there. It's a workaround to the fundamental problem of it's an election for the board of the radio station about the radio station, and the radio station tries not to talk about it.
Yeah.
That's a weird structure. And once you set that up, you're going to have these weird end arounds in response to it.
Yeah, of course. I would like to go back to programming. Right now, it seems that the programming is not as diverse as it should be, and it seems like it was before. The one time that there was an on-air live call-in forum at the end, and I can't remember if it made it on air. I know it made it to the website for sure, and I did the editing on that. A caller who was under 30 said that one of the reasons why he doesn't come to KPFA, they're self-identified, he didn't come to KPFA because the programming wasn't diverse. I would also, and he actually out of the program, I was like, oh yeah, no, I would move that to online or a podcast or anything. And then for me also, musically, it seems that we have a very, again, not a diverse genre that covers, and I will speak specifically to hip hop. And when I've mentioned this before, they mentioned Hard Knock Radio. I was like, where they do interview musicians on the too, but that's really more of a like hip hop as in the political arm program. It's not a straight music program. Whereas I remember in the past that there was, a lot more, not just, but a lot of them actually were local artists, which is great to support. So can you talk about diversity in, again, just specifically the music side and how that might tie to bringing more members in, please?
Well, when I was the program coordinator, I used to laugh because I had a part-time job and flexible hours. So basically I would come in at different times of day. And when I came in during the workday, was a completely different experience. So when I came in the late afternoon to early evenings, I would hang around and the station would kind of turn over and it would become much more melanin was present and the average age dropped by about 20 years. So it was like the day shift and the night shift. And actually, if you pay attention to what is on KPFA after 9 p.m. until about 5 a.m., it's enormously diverse. It's mostly music and it's enormously diverse. However, it is on in the middle of the night when most of us are sleeping. So basically the station's sort of, hedge around diversity challenges is to sort of stick it all on, but stick it on at particular times of the day. Now, we are moving to an on-demand media landscape. So the reality is the time that things are broadcast is not as important as it used to be. And the station could potentially promote these things that are on in the middle of the night as sort of on-demand products. And that would do a great deal for their diversity profile. But they are used to ignoring the young people who come in the middle of the night to make music. And I think that culture is still kind of established in terms of what gets highlighted on the website and what people can see. The other sort of diversity hedge is to bring in a lot of young folks of color through the apprenticeship program or as interns or as new hires in shows that are largely quite dominated. And to say, well, yes, we have young folks of color working here, and they are working there. But they're not really in editorial gatekeeping positions, right? They're just sort of doing, the daily production kind of grunt work, which kind of has to be done. But the decision making, not so much. And that said, the station's GM is a man of color. So it's not that it's not present. It's just that, as we all say, diversity is really part of the issue, but it's not the entire issue, because it sort of has to do with who are we targeting the programming at? Where are we getting the money to go forward? And what's the sort of, what's the basis for the decisions that are being made? Because neoliberal decision-making can be made by anyone of any color, and often is. So diversity is sort of part of it, but really this comes down to sort of questions of power. And I think that we will see that you can have a diverse workforce and yet you can have concentrated power. That's kind of the case at KPFA. And it's slippery and it's hard to define for that reason, right? Because diversity is easy. You just count people by skin color, but that doesn't always change the power dynamics. And I think we can all see that the power dynamics are not as diverse as they should be. I will say that having Kat Brooks on the morning show has helped as a co-host somewhat, because she does make an effort to cover issues that are important to the Black community. And I appreciate the fact that she does that. What level of internal opposition she faces, who knows? But I think she does. On the other hand, it's never about figureheads. It's about the whole structure. And I think that we all see that the whole structure continues to be somewhat gatekept.
Thank you. Yeah, they could be a little more open again on having equal voice. But I guess I should have also said, I would love to see it more message hip hop. When I say that specifically, like Dead Prez, KRS-One, and there's a couple, but I would like to see more. And I see two. The first question from the chat: are there some other Pacifica stations that are more diverse in their programming or in promoting on-demand shows already?
There are stations that are more diverse in their programming. I would point to the two East Coast stations. I know you hear that WBAI is a disaster, and yes, they've got some financial challenges, not all of which are their own fault, but they do have the most radical programming in the network, no doubt about it, and the most diverse, and people might want to kind of check that out. Also, WPFW is historically a station embedded in the Black community in Washington. And by every stretch of the imagination, it is both diverse, and I mean that both in terms of the programming itself and in terms of the power dynamics at the station. It's not a white-dominated station. So the answer to that is yes, but they are both smaller stations considerably. And as we've talked about in the competition between the stations, KPFA is constantly throwing around the fact that they have more money to sort of say that they're right and the other stations are wrong, which of course is a completely vapid kind of argument to make. We have more money, so we're right. I mean, it's nonsense. The second part of the question was, I'm sorry, I kind of lost.
Do they have more on-demand programming shows as well? Have they tried that model?
Yeah, basically all of the stations are terrible about that. I mean, they have programming archives, and as you know, you have that at KPFA. You can always go back and pull out a program, but you have to sort of know what you're looking for. So in terms of, browsing things that you might want to listen to, it's kind of useless because you have to know the date and time they broadcasted. You have to go back to a certain day and all the list of programs that aired on that day and pick it out, and no one's going to do that. And I think in the case of all of the stations, basically they have an archive, but they haven't come up with a way to meaningfully present on-demand programming in a way that would draw people in. You have to basically already be a fan, and you have to know exactly what you're looking for. And as people have pointed out for a long time, often in an hour or 2 hour long show, especially from public affairs, there's a number of different interviews that go on, for example, and those aren't indexed in any meaningful way. So if, for example, you're a random person looking for information on a particular subject or an interview with a particular person, you can't find it in Pacifica's archives because it's not indexed, the search word, for that particular entity. So the value of the programming archive to bring people in is not what it should be.
Thank you. And I have then another question from the chat. How do you feel the overall balance of music and talk programming? Would there be benefit in having more music and or engagement in local music scenes? Is the ratio likely to change in the future one way or the other? And I would add also, is there possibly a benefit to having more straight call-in shows, just where people can come in and comment?
Good. Those are good questions. In terms of the ratio of music to public affairs, and we should also, mention the arts, which used to have a strong presence on the Pacifica stations, and now it's almost nothing. But when I came in as the program coordinator, I was told that ratio at KPFA had been worked out by some endless negotiation process between programmers, not with the audience, and that it was essentially frozen and could not be changed. I don't think having anything frozen and not subject to change is good programming policy. And that was 20 years ago. So you would think at some point it's subject to change, right? But that's where turf stuff comes in, and people who have been there for X amount of years, for decades, to be candid, have a lot of clout in the internal balance of power about that. So it's very much an internalized process. And it's one that, as I said, has been frozen. It's not set in stone. The other Pacifica stations have different balances. Probably WBAI has the most public affairs. Houston is almost entirely a music station with just little bits of public affairs. So people handle it differently. KPFA has a fairly high number of public affairs because they make more money from that than from music. That possibly could change if the music changed. I don't know. In terms of what's a good idea? Well, I mean, I'm biased towards the public affairs. That's because I do what I do for a living, and I'm concerned about the quality of the news. But I do, understand that music serves an important purpose and that people want it, and that being embedded with that community is important. What I would say is that a lot of KPFA's music programs have been on for a darn long time. I mean, decades and decades. And while it covers a lot of genres, a fair bit of it is maybe genres that had a little more oomph 30 or 40 years ago. And there is perhaps a deficit of music that is a little bit, speaks more to modern tastes. There is a lot of folk, there's a lot of bluegrass, there's a lot of jazz. These are honorable forms of music. They are also forms of music that have been around for hundreds of years. And while it's good to be an ethnomusicologist, it's also important to stay current with the times. And I think that there's been a challenge, there's been a challenge there in a number of ways. And when that challenge is met, it's usually met like at 3 o'clock in the morning, which is not exactly prime time. So yes, I think that could definitely be improved. But it becomes, a turf kind of thing, because it's true that if people have volunteered for 20, 30, 40 years, and they brought in money and they have an established audience, they feel like they're owed a certain amount of deference. And to some degree, that's true. You don't want to treat people like crap when they volunteered for decades. That's not right. But there's a line between deference and respect and ownership of a time slot. And we are constantly falling over that line. It used to be a joke at KPFA, and it's actually not a joke, that people could like hand their time slots over to their children or their spouses. And that actually happened like more than once, which is downright crazy. And it just goes to show you when you you walk close to the line, then you go over the line, then you jump over the line into crazy land, because that should never happen at something that is a community outlet owned by the people. It's not owned by the programmers. And you don't get to leave your program to someone in your will. Just no.
Right. I want to side again, and something you had mentioned before when we were talking about the two slates and money spent and election side of it too. Is the irony of having just two sides lost on you at all compared to the actual electoral political system in cities and states and other? I mean, do you see those similarities?
No, it's not lost to me at all. However, what I would say is that within the Pacifica system,
Mhm.
when there are more than two sides, when there have been, for example, 3 slates, the chaos level has gotten even higher than usual.
Wow.
It kind of almost gets worse when people don't organize themselves into this group and that group.
Right.
But I think when it comes to all the things we're actually talking about, there are definitely more than two sides. At KPFA, there's a particular polarization to the argument, because the Save KPFA, KPFA Protectors people have been active in literally setting up new organizations to collect KPFA after Pacifica breaks up, which is a pretty dramatic thing. And they've done it 3 times since 2015. The KPFA Foundation, the Big Tent Foundation, or whatever that was, and now this Pacifica safety net effort. So in a sense, everybody that's opposed to that, and there are good reasons to be opposed to it, which we can talk about, ends up on the other side, because that's such a dramatic and wacky and extreme kind of suggestion to make. So in some ways, that kind of takes what would be a diversity of viewpoints and makes it very stark. You agree with that kind of thing, or you don't agree with that kind of thing, right? It's a yes or no question. But I do think with all the things that we've been talking about, of course, there's a multiplicity of views. I don't have an easy answer for there should be more music, there should be less music. I can see both sides of it. And I don't think that, anyone who came down on a different side from me is my enemy, because I think there's good arguments on both sides. What there's not a good argument for is, if I don't get my way, I'm going to trash the network. So in some ways, it's more of a methodologies and a tactics separation than it is a real disagreement about, the kinds of challenges that you face programming any radio station, because there are lots of challenges, and people are not always going to feel the same way. But if you feel like I'm going to take my marbles and go home if I can't get my way, things.
Right, I hear that. Then another one coming from the chat. 2 of the most prominent political issues are the environment and racism. Youth are critically important in both of these, such as the vast majority of those who participated in the George Floyd protest, as well as environmental groups like the Sunrise Movement and Fridays for Future. I'd also say I don't know more. Is there a way to integrate that with programming to get more youth involved?
Sure. I mean, I already spoke about the idea that you can reach out to organizations and offer them some time to do a special about something that's important that's going on. And I think that should be happening on a regular basis. And the idea that organizations can't do this is crazy. They absolutely can. They put out podcasts all the time. It's not that different. And in fact, some of those podcasts could be played on the radio. I mean, in and of itself. The technology is such that there's no sort of, huge barrier to entry to doing that. The only barrier to entry is programmers that don't want to give up their time ever. And that's something that we have to work on, right? I think that, KPFA tried to respond to Black Lives Matter by adding Kat Brooks as the co-host of the morning show. And she's definitely brought those issues into prime time, and that is good. But to some degree, it's a figurehead kind of thing, in the sense that it's one person and what that person wants to highlight. And I think she's doing a pretty good job, but I would like to see it be a little more in multiples. There are any number of groups that are working on ending and abolishing racism. There are any number of groups that are working on climate change. And rather than picking one and saying, you cover this subject, it would be good if we were a little more open to the multiplicity and the broadness of the left and reached out to lots of groups. And, if they do a crappy job, so what? So you gave them an hour and you don't give them an hour. Again, it's not the end of the world. If you look at KPFA's old program schedule way back when, in the 60s and the 70s, when it was supporting the counterculture, it was, panopticon of stuff. It wasn't like the same things every week. There were new programs on constantly. There were specials. Some things went on for 3 hours. Some things were on for 20 minutes. And that sort of provided a way you would send out a folio to the listeners and look at this neat stuff we have coming on this month. Mark your calendars. And you don't even have to mark your calendars now because things can be on demand. But this month we are featuring this, that, and the other thing. We have a playwright. He's going to come read his play out loud. He doesn't have a program, but he's going to do this one time. And this is an opportunity that you have. And we're doing it, Wednesday, March 12th. And, on March 28th, there's a writer in town. Rather than having them as a guest on a show, we're going to do a staged reading. And so these kinds of things, which were direct to the community, really made it a different thing every month. There were interesting things, and you had to read to see what was going on and what you could listen to. And even though the Corporation for Public Broadcasting said, no, you can't do radio that way, I think it was exciting and interesting. I've looked at those folios and those old schedules, and they look pretty enticing to me. And I think we might want to move a little bit more in that direction. And I think it would greatly enhance community involvement, and it would greatly enhance the interest of the broadcast schedule. I mean, for example, I love Against the Grain. It's a good program, but it's been on for a long time. And many of the programs are the same, like really the same. And I just feel like at this point, there's very little that I can hear from that program that I haven't heard before. So let's shake it up every once in a while. Every 4 weeks, let's not put it on. Let's put on something else in that time slot. That's new and different. This is sort of what we have to do, both to keep interest up and to, provide a bit of what they used to call the patchwork quilt. I think it would help.
I would piggyback with that. Someone piggybacked inside as well, bringing those groups in. I would also throw my vertical fate out there with you as well, and not just Against the Grain, but Visionary Activist Show, actually Middle East and North Africa as well. There's several that, like you said, like even if it was once every other month, you're like, hey, we're going to throw something special in there too. And I miss the plays on Sunday night. There was, play the thing. I'm sure you could do it here. And then I would also add Kat Brooks and Brian have great chemistry. Again, and I'm in the business. They do have great chemistry. Throwing my full, just being vulnerable out there. They do promote ATPT quite a bit. It's a great organization, but there is kind of a conflict of interest since, Kat is, one of the founding members, if not the, but one of the founding members of that group, and has been in it too. And there are tons of other groups out there that, again, like you say, could be integrated into to having specials and shows. And like I say, it could be theater, it could be music. Oh gosh, all types of stuff would be awesome to have. I would like to sort of come at the next question, if there's not a lot coming from the audience, but to talk about, I only have a few more left, the two slates and about the infighting, about how much, and I think at least what I heard something you say, Tracy, too, is that it doesn't matter how good the position could be. Rescue Pacifica could come with great, the candidates, because some of their slate were already members, could come with such a great idea, but then the other side, the protectors, would not support it just because they don't like them. There is so much ego within, and they're spies. I also mentioned about having to, once I started to run, going to a lot of the meetings too, and who is that? Identify yourself, and all that just really, really freaks me out. Can you talk about how that is actually hurting the station, them just kind of going back at each other, and then also ending that with how to, if we were to get rid of slates altogether for the elections of local station boards?
Well, polarity hurts everything. And we see that in our political system. And of course, we see it at KPFA. When people get locked into sides, and basically they start operating like members of a team. My team is good and your team is bad. And the goal of the board meetings is my team wins and your team loses. Because basically it's a football game, right? And everyone's trying to score a touchdown, which you do basically by knocking the other side out of your way. Nothing good is going to come of that. But more importantly, issues that require nuance. We talked a bit like more music, less music, and that have good arguments on both sides, get totally squashed by that kind of dialogue because they're nuanced issues. There's no one right answer. You have to balance things and come up with an appropriate solution. And you can't do that when you're playing touch football. The fact that the collections organized candidates to create storytelling, if we get rid of slates, it would help enormously. I have to do in a scenario then their candidates known because otherwise, right? And those are made possible. So
We lost you again for a second, and your laptop is still trying to connect to audio videos there. For your yes, no, can't.
Okay, well, let's try
Oh,
this.
there you go.
Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
All right. So what I was basically
Recording in progress.
yeah, well, now I should shut the
Oh
power.
yeah, you're gonna have feedback.
Yeah, I'll make that stop.
People trip on that. I'm like, this is my favorite part of live events. When shit, it is, totally is. Problem solving, fixing them, especially now in the virtual world.
We're good now. I'm
Okay.
so sorry. I
No,
don't
don't you dare apologize.
actually have these problems. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, blame Sonic. Anyway, so what we were saying. Yeah, but if you got rid of slates without the ability for the candidates to make their positions, known over the air, then you end up with sort of nothing, right? So there's an original sin here, which is the stations hiding the elections from the listeners who have to vote in. And you have to sort of get back to the root of that original sin, or you're not really going to be able to kind of solve the team slates, polarity kind of problem. I mean, what you want is nuanced conversation, and you want people to agree that whatever the outcome is of that conversation, that there will be consensus on it going forward. You can't really run anything or operate anything without that kind of structure, and it is largely missing on the KPFA local station board. It has been for a very long time.
Right. I have two more. Is all I have. Is I wanted to again kind of tie open equal elections with fundraising, because it kind of there was a fund drive during the actual voting process. And like I've mentioned, I think the 10% is like atrocious. I'm like, where the hell are we? And let's strive to be better. What would your thoughts be on using the campaign again? So when it would open, because every candidate could be live on air, I wanted to see actual debates. I tried to organize one, and the protectors like just would not even entertain like the idea. And I was saying, no, it'd be a debate like with judges, and there'd be an actual winner. And I wanted both sides plus all the independent candidates. So I guess technically there would have been 2 slates and a bunch of guys and girls that are just, you know, just there, a bunch of people or however they identify. But so having it on air live and then using that also as a fundraising apparatus to try and get more people involved.
Yeah, I mean, people have been proposing those kinds of things for a long time. They've never gotten any traction. The fact that only 10 to 15% vote is definitely a problem. It's fair to say, though, that in nonprofit elections everywhere, that's pretty much what the numbers are. Years ago, KQED actually had people vote to end the election so they would never have to vote again, and people did by a somewhat overwhelming margin. They basically eradicated their own voting rights in the organization. And as we've seen, KQED, while they have a lot of money, is not particularly well embedded in the community and never really has been, right? But that's the direction that they went. I mean, ideally, you would want to have voting rates well over 50%, preferably 75%, but we're a long ways away from that. Visibility would help, but it's extremely difficult. And unfortunately, the election system is basically relies on the goodwill of station staff and station management in terms of membership lists and, you know, technical things like that you have to have. And if those things get sort of, you know, passively aggressively not done, then you have an election on the verge of failure. So it has become more of a negotiation, and the negotiation has been, don't make us put things on air and we'll be cooperative, make us put things on air and we won't be. And that is, you know, not ideal. And I think it's contributed largely to the kind of slate polarity that we're talking about, because the candidates have had to take things into their own hands, and what they've done sort of makes sense in the short term for what their goals are, trying to get elected. But in the long term, it's making everything worse. Because really what we should have is independent candidates. That's how it should be.
Right.
But
well,
it just
isn't
doesn't
it,
make any sense.
Isn't it also, because I guess you could make a case that if we were to have them live on the way that the local station boards are and how the fighting goes, I mean, and then one of the local station board, like someone actually told someone, like screamed at them to shut up, like, which fathoms me. I think if we were on there, we might even turn more people off than on in that aspect. So there's also coming from the chat. Oh, actually, I can answer this one. So there is, Justin, there is the Pacifica, all of the videos and forums are online. They just didn't seem to be promoted a lot on air until the end. And it didn't seem also as if it was all that enthusiastic. I also suspected, though, and maybe this is something else to talk about, and I do see another one come from the chat, is that I kind of defended Renee a lot more, because I don't think she has a team. When I talk about like, oh, I'd like to join Renee's team and assist, I don't think it's a team. Like, it'd be a team if it was Renee and I, right? It would be 2 people. I think that is there. So it just wasn't promoted a lot. At all, but they're still all online, and on our shameless plug Oakland Green Party YouTube channel, I have it didn't go up on the national, but I have after the forum that I was part of, one of the online forums, the off air and the two slates, the candidates that were from two states, I've never seen them more civil to each other. And someone actually even joked that, oh boy, if local station boards were this civil, they would get a lot more done. But those are on,
Yep.
that is actually up on our YouTube channel and has
Well,
been.
there's definitely something to being watched. People behave better when they're being watched.
Right.
No doubt about it, right?
Right.
I mean, the person who yelled at a public commenter to shut up is a person that has a temper problem. I mean, that much is clear. Just can't tolerate disagreement.
Yeah, right.
But again, if there were anybody watching, if there were more people watching it, that behavior would be harder to get away with. I mean, there's no doubt about it. But I think what it kind of, comes down to is, again, the best way to reach the listeners of a radio station is on the radio station. I mean, no doubt about it. That's the only thing that ties them together. They listen to the radio station, right? And if you were able, and I think cutting down the size of the board would help here because, 24 seats, you're doing what, 12 each year, you have 20 odd candidates. That's a lot of people and a lot of programming time. So smaller boards would definitely make that a little more manageable from a logistical point of view. But because I've, over the years, because it's been so many years, I have been on KPFA talking about internal stuff occasionally with programmers that want to have that conversation. And it's clear to me that there's a hunger out there. People want to talk about the station and what's happening and what they'd like to see and what's going on. There's no doubt about it. People call in, they respond. And they want to talk. Often they want to talk at great length. They go on and on about what they like and what they don't like. So there's definitely interest, but you have to come up with a way to do it that is engaging, and you have to come up and you have to sort of, deal with all of the turf issues that basically say, well, if my program's not on air every single week, then I'm going to lose my slot. So I must fight. I must fight ever being preempted, which is generally the programmer's point of view. And the reason that they feel that way is justified because the process for getting programs on and off the air has never been formalized. The communication is generally terrible and people are legitimately paranoid. And they feel like if they're not there every week, their time slot will disappear, and they've got to hold on to it. They've got to hold on to it so tight that the veins can their hands pop up. And that's what people are doing. And this is, not healthy.
Thanks, Tracy. This is Justin. I'm jumping in. Vicente stepped away momentarily. But to keep this going, there's another question in the chat, comment from Greg. Perhaps we should try to find out how other nonprofits deal with their elections. For example, the Sierra Club or other nonprofits that have elections don't immediately come to mind, but there must be others. And I mean, of course, of other community radio stations who probably have their own ways of doing it.
Yeah, there are some examples out there. People, I'm sure, heard about the big mess on the Sierra Club a couple of years ago. There was some kind of alternative slate. There was a lot of tumult and everything else. That said, the interloper slate was defeated. Yeah, there are definitely examples out there. I think in a lot of cases, when you look at not-for-profit elections, you basically have an endorsement process where the leadership of the institution, the paid employees, the executive director, et cetera, sort of, bring forward candidates and say, these are the candidates that we want you guys to vote for because we're aligned with them and they will carry forward what the organization is currently doing. And the members basically go with that. So, and there isn't a lot of competition. There isn't a lot of multiple candidates, can multiple slates. In my experience, that's how nonprofit board elections, when they have them, usually go. And if you were to allow the staff and the ED and so on and all of these folks to make endorsements in kind of an organized way rather than the unorganized way, they would likely support the status quo. They normally do when they make their endorsements, which might or might not be good. Pacifica tries to make it hard for those folks to slant the elections, for better or for worse. So I think some of the models that are out there are kind of not that helpful. But I think what you're looking at here is you have different visions for how the organization should go forward. And the only way to sort of reconcile those different visions is to kind of talk it out. And the more that Pacifica avoids doing that, and KPFA avoids doing that, the more things fester and the more polarized things get. So we're not really helping the situation by kind of shoving this all underground and making it all internal, dirty politics that we don't want to trouble the listeners with, which is kind of what the philosophy is. It's a turnoff, blah, 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 blah. But what that means is that when decisions are made, the listeners are not particularly involved. The voters are not particularly involved. So when they're voting on, they're not sure what most of the time. And the big overarching questions, which in the end have to be sort of driven by the members, because they're going to have to support what comes out of it. The big questions, that go way back to the 1980s and have never been solved, just sit there and fester and fester and fester. And they get more painful and more painful as the years go by. So we are now into some 40-year arguments that we haven't settled yet. And nobody should argue about anything for 40 years. It's a really bad idea, because after 40 years, no one's willing to lose, right? They've been having this argument their whole lives. And, at a certain point, it has to be resolved, because the station cannot be everything to everybody. In the end, it has to make a decision about who its audience is, what kind of programming it does, who its audience isn't, and what kind of programming it doesn't do. Because any organization has to make those calls. And that's what a board is for.
Right. Wow. Well, we are at our last question. And first, I want to start out first. Last question. And I just want to say thank you to Tracy for participating, and for the 7 viewers. I will edit this for you, but also we always put up the raw materials too for the 7 people doing it. And I also want to mention that we will be going back to live in-person events in 2022. So the free dinner and movie discussion series will be coming back. We will have our public general meetings in person. Both of those are at It's Your Move Games over in beautiful Temescal. And you can get all that direct information from our website, www.oaklandgreens.org. You can also please go to our other social media, which would be Oakland Green Party YouTube. You can contact me directly at oaklandgreenparty@gmail.com. You can check us out on Instagram under Oakland Greens, and you can also do us on Facebook as well with the Oakland Greens as well. So with my final question for you, Tracy, actually is around social media, where I can only speak from my own experience in trying to and it has happened. We've been very, very fortunate. I'm not going to not say that about the Oakland Greens being more out and getting more engagement. It hasn't translated into a more steady fundraising abilities, but definitely engagement globally on our Instagram with Greens Around has really boosted our presence online, and just having discussions about how the things that kind of we're talking about here. Is there a larger role that social media can play with KPFA and Pacifica in general? And I mean specifically not just Facebook, but Instagram, possibly TikTok. I haven't graduated to TikTok yet, but is there a role for social media in this?
Sure. Social media is one of the best ways to get a message out there, and audio is extremely well suited to social media, right? You definitely, you have a product that can easily be posted and sampled on social media. There's a couple of different, obstacles that are in place. One is the question of, is it centralized, or is it every program and every programmer for themselves? I think Pacifica has largely pushed towards every programmer for themselves. And that leads to it leads to sort of this nebulous type of effect. It doesn't sort of brand the station or the network in any sort of meaningful way. And it sort of, mixes the line between self-promotion and the promotion of the station, right? Because you're kind of doing both at the same time and people weigh it differently. So it would be better if you had centralized social media. The centralized social media that exists is pretty controlled and I think not overwhelmingly interesting. I mean, I'm subscribed to KPFA's Facebook and KPFA's Twitter. I wouldn't say that any of it kind of blows me away. And that, that partially might have to do with the control factor, but it's also time consuming. And there are, KPFA has a lot of staff, but some of the other stations, at least there's limited staff. I go back to sort of the problem with the archives because on-demand audio is a really great thing to advertise on social media, but it has to be easy for people to access. The on-demand logistics have to be simple, and people need to be able to browse in a meaningful way, because the idea, and YouTube demonstrates this, is that you kind of go from thing to thing, and you're not really able to do that within Pacifica's archival audio collection in quite the same way. And also shorter segments. If everything is an hour or 30 minutes, that's a lot for people to listen to. But to the extent that people can break their programs up into short, swallowable segments, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, I think they would be much more effective on social media, because the whole point of social media is not to reach your regular audience because they're already there. It's to reach new people. So you have to give them sort of a snippet to entice them to go further. And then when they go further, they have to sort of have an interface that they can negotiate kind of easily. The snippet should take you to the full program, and the full program should take you to 2 or 3 other episodes of the program that you might like. And then you take people to the full program archive, right? It kind of happens in steps. And that whole infrastructure, it just doesn't kind of exist. So people are doing the best that they can within kind of an awkward interface. And if you were to go, write grants or something, that's the kind of thing that you could go get money for, to update your archival audio system so it's user friendly. And that's like the kind of thing that I would like to see happen, but that often doesn't happen because we're playing tug of war.
Right. Well, thank you. That brings us to the end. And I want to mention we're going to do this again tomorrow, 6:30 p.m., not this particular show, but we have our final event, virtual event of 2021, and keeping up with the rights of women. We're doing a discussion on Sesta Fosta and how sex workers are coping, and is it really stopping sex trafficking, or is it just hurting consensual adults who organize in the sex industry, and also what it does to free speech. I will mention again that we're going back to live in-person events. We will be keeping the virtual event, which will be the day before, so it'll be the last Saturday of the month in the afternoon. We will be doing them, and it'll be more of a party atmosphere. Bring your own booze, bring your own intoxicants, and just again having the discussions of different topics. I will endeavor to have that again for our 7 watchers on YouTube. Endeavor to have that up for tomorrow's pre-show, most diverse music and social media. And social justice, right there, to have, because we've already picked the 2022 season already. Thank you again, Tracy, and I look forward to keeping this discussion going. Again, my name is Vicente Cruz, event and fundraising coordinator and producer for the Oakland Greens. And yeah, thanks everyone. Have a great evening.
Thank you for having me. It was great talking with you guys.
It was great. Bye all.
Bye-bye.